All right, it looks like first item is the approval of minutes for the May 27th, 2021.
Move to approve.
Second.
All right, minutes are approved. On to the second. We have the state legislation update.
All right. Oh, go ahead, Susan.
Yeah, go ahead. I was just going to mention we also have Anthony Hempstead, who should be joining us, and Eric Lane, one of our planners, is going to start, and Denise will complete the presentation.
All right, hopefully everybody can see it properly.
Yes.
Okay, good. So thank you for the opportunity and the time. Today we're here to discuss the House Bill 1220 legislation that passed through and essentially get your feedback on it. So just a quick background. It passed earlier this year to address emergency shelters and housing. The changes that the city must consider are things like comprehensive and housing plan updates, long-term items like that, as well as short-term things like zoning, development regulations, things that are regarding emergency and permanent supportive housing. Within that bill as well, there was another component. Actually, whenever Anthony is here, sorry, I meant to include, I don't see him on here. So if he does join us, he has some additional points to add as well. But lastly was that there were some additional changes related to accessory dwelling units. However, that was a last minute veto that was changed due to a GMA technicality. We may see that later on, but we just wanted to bring that to your attention that that could be something 6 months to a year down the road. So the first thing we wanted to do was kind of break down what it is that this bill is addressing and kind of the overall terminology. Transitional housing in a broad sense is a project that provides housing and supportive services to homeless persons and families for up to 2 years that has a purpose facilitating the movement of homeless persons and families into independent living. So within that kind of umbrella, you have emergency housing, and that's temporary indoor accommodations for individuals and families who are homeless or at an imminent risk of becoming homeless. And that is intended to address the basic health, food, clothing, and personal hygiene needs. And then additional, the other item is the emergency shelter. And that's a facility that provides temporary shelter for individuals or families who are currently homeless. Emergency shelter facilities may include day and warming centers that do not provide overnight accommodations. And then the other option is permanent supportive housing. And this is your subsidized lease housing, no limit of length of stay. It prioritizes people who need comprehensive supportive services to retain tenancy and utilizes admissions practices designed to lower barriers to entry than would be for typical other subsidized or unsubsidized rental housing, especially as it relates to rental history. So people with evictions, criminal histories, and background checks or personal behaviors. The idea is that this takes a housing first model approach when it comes to homelessness.
Okay, so there's a couple provisions related to this bill effective on the 25th of July, which is the effective day of the law. Cities are required to allow transitional housing and permanent housing in all zones where hotels or residential dwelling units are allowed. And so this provision preempts our local authority. Next slide, please. Then effective, the other piece of the law relates to indoor emergency shelters and indoor emergency housing. So this component becomes effective September 30th of this year. And under this provision, cities cannot prohibit indoor emergency shelters or indoor emergency housing in any zones where hotels are allowed. There is a provision for cities that authorized by ordinance in a majority of zones within a 1 mile radius proximity to transit. The cities can impose reasonable occupancy and spacing and intensity of use requirements in order to protect public health and safety. However, per the RCW, ordinances cannot prevent the siting of a sufficient number of these housing and shelter types that are necessary to accommodate a city's projected need under, so as part of their comprehensive planning. So there's two options in moving forward to address these requirements. The first one is more straightforward, and that is to allow in zones where hotels are allowed. We currently allow hotels in the institutional campus, community commercial, downtown commercial, highway commercial, Pacific Ridge commercial, transit community, and our Woodmont commercial, plus our RM 900 zone. And so we are recommending this approach because the other option would be to consider allowing in the majority of zones within 1 mile of transit. So that would require us mapping all of the transit stops and routes and applying that 1 mile radius around all of those stops. And we feel that it's going to capture the majority of the zones within the city. We have about 20 zones. And this option would result in a broader geographic area and more allowed zones. So that's this piece of it. Next slide, please. Again, I mentioned that we can impose occupancy, spacing, and intensity of use requirements. So spacing between these types of facility, proximity to transit, density. We looked into what some of the other jurisdictions are doing. Maple Valley has some interim provisions that only allow for one continuously operating emergency shelter. So that is something we can look into. Next slide, please. Comprehensive plan update. So there is some new policy language that we need to consider adding to our comprehensive plan. So typically our policies use the term encourage, and there is more stringent phrasing to plan for and accommodate the affordable housing, to support affordable housing in our community. One of the things that, while our comp plan does talk about range of incomes, there's a emphasis on addressing low, very low, and extremely low income households. So that is something we will be evaluating, adding some definitions for emergency and permanent supportive housing, and documenting our programs that address affordable housing. So for example, South King County Housing and Homelessness Partnership is our entity. And so a lot of the work that they have been doing, we will be evaluating and looking at where we can strengthen the policies in our comp plan. And this would be documented or docketed for our 2021 comp plan amendments. Next slide. So basically for us, the direction that we want to go is really looking at the two options. One where we're recommending where we allow in zones where hotels are allowed. So these are the mostly commercial zones. And with that, we would look for the committee's support in pursuing this direction, and we can prepare the draft code changes and bring back those to the committee at their next meeting for discussion, and then move forward to City Council for consideration at a public hearing and for then the adoption. Susan, do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, maybe we kind of missed Anthony at the beginning, Hempstead. So would he like to give us a little more of the background of how this legislation came to be?
Sure, Susan. Yeah, this legislation was quite controversial and had been pushed by the city of Seattle more than anyone else, and some legislators, key legislators as well. It really split the city community, and that many suburban cities had real concerns on, and AWC in general had concerns on how this legislation really forces all cities to act. And while it does give options, they're very limited options. It ended up passing only 25-24 in the Senate, so can't be any closer than that. And it passed on a party line vote in the House. So while controversial, and it may not be exactly as all of us would like it to be, it is what it is, and we do need to act according to the legislation and its fairly stringent timelines.
Thanks, Anthony. And then just one other comment, just to make sure it's clear that we really only have the options related to the emergency housing. For the permanent supportive housing, we really don't. That's has to be allowed in all zones that allow hotels or residential dwelling units. Where we do have some flexibility or some ability to regulate is related to intensity of use, density, locational criteria, that kind of thing. So that's really where we have the most discretion, other than the two options for the emergency shelter.
Might be a good idea to let the committee members come up for air now and get some feedback from them. We've thrown a lot of stuff at them here, so.
Yeah.
So I've got a question in regard to permanent supportive housing. Under that definition, is everything multifamily in permanent supportive housing? Do they have any options for individual units? Okay, there's that picture right there. So you've got individual units, but they're all on one lot. Do you ever have, just as a random question, do you ever have permanent supportive housing as a single family residence? Is there a single family residence that can be qualified or?
So it wouldn't necessarily be restricted, but as far as a permanent supportive housing model is concerned, it's entirely reliant on numbers of individuals that are coming through grant programs, through nonprofit funding. And so to see that level of a facility operating for a singular person or singular dwelling, singular family is extremely, I've never seen one in an instance, and that's the case. So generally speaking, it's a multifamily housing, 5, 10 or more. The one below here is one in Tacoma. It's called the Nativity House, operated by Catholic Community Services, where they have permanent supportive housing, a day center, shelter, as well as emergency housing all in one.
And so now what are the criteria for deciding how many units or what the density is going to be in a city or in a zone? For example, do they use the one-time count and then, or the census, or is it a per capita thing? How do they establish what the need is per community? And for example, how would Des Moines establish what the need is in our community? And is that need divided up into zones? For example, Woodmont, Redondo, Marina, North Hill. And for example, if you've got 25 homeless people needing permanent supportive housing, but they're all located in one area, is that where the permanent supportive housing needs to be located, or can it be located somewhere within the city boundaries? So that was a
I'll jump
convoluted
in.
question, but
Yeah, I'll jump in there a little bit. First, I want to I acknowledge, like, Eric has previously been a housing planner, so he has a very good handle on what is going to be economic. But having said that, I also want to make sure that, you know, we have received inquiries related to a type of group housing with supportive services. So it is possible that we could get something like that. But as Eric mentions, it may not be economically feasible for the organizations to have those smaller facilities. As far as how we determine our need, that's an analysis that we will do when we update our housing element. And our partnership with South King County Housing, they should be able to help us with some of the analysis. There'll be a methodology that pretty much will be consistent throughout the jurisdictions, and we don't really know exactly what that will be yet. Denise may have a little more information because she attends a lot of the planning director meetings, but there's an analysis that will happen, and we will determine our need based on that analysis, and it will flow into our comprehensive plan update. So there'll be more information on that coming later.
so then once we get that data, whoever provides it, you know, if Skip provides it through a dashboard or something, then according to this, we'll be required to incorporate that data into our comprehensive plan. And then will we have a time period where we will be required to somehow through a partnership or the city responsibility to provide housing for the data set? Is that how
it's not really it's our responsibility to make progress on both our housing and employment targets, and that relates to the different types of housing. But generally that housing, it could be usually provided by private providers. Our partnership with South King County, you know, homeless housing and homelessness, if they have a capital fund, it might be something that would be a public or King County. I mean, there are a lot of you know, a lot of pieces to the housing, affordable housing, but it wouldn't necessarily be that the city would be required to actually build or construct that type of housing. If we don't make adequate progress on our targets, then, you know, there'll be a compliance process and evaluation that we would need to do, and to see what other steps do we need to take with our comprehensive planning and development regulations to help that process along and making progress on our targets.
So, and I'm monopolizing the questions here, so somebody raise your hand. But so through our partnership with Skip, if we are contributing, for example, our 1406 funds will be contributing to the capital fund with Skip. So if we show that we've got this contribution that is targeted for this issue, and let's say this partnership of 10 cities then builds a facility, but it's not located in Des Moines, but we have partnered in this capital fund to build this, does that then qualify for our targeted need in our comp plan? When let's say we've incorporated the data into our comp plan and we have to provide a certain number of units, does our contribution to Skip then qualify? Do you know?
So maybe Denise wants to also chime in here, but generally speaking, that could be one of the measures that we can point to in a compliance review to say that we're making some progress, but we still would have our own targets that we or need within our city that we'd be responsible for. I don't know if you have anything further on that, Denise.
I don't. I was going to say the same thing. We are responsible for our own targets, so that would be something we would have to consider, that it would meet the reasonable measures, and financial contribution might be something that could be considered.
Well,
Okay.
if
Mayor.
that ends up being the case, then the council may want to reconsider the redirection of its
Yes.
housing money to that.
So
And that's one of
It's
the,
tricky because you don't want to get into the position of Mercer Island paying for their affordable housing in another city. So we still have our own requirements to meet our local demand.
Okay, Mayor Matt.
okay, I'm having a hard time with that because organizations spend money in other locations to mitigate their impact quite often. And so I really want to make sure that we understand that and understand the legal ramifications of it. The other thing is, I really want to know more about what Maple Valley has done. I think we should have the ability to, limit to what is practical. And the other thing is that every time something like this comes into play, there's usually a proximity to kind of clause in it. I mean, can we put one of these right next to an elementary school? Can somebody say, we want to put one in some location that could potentially provide risk to the community? I mean, there's a lot that's been said here, but it's a lot of gray. And so, and I want to thank Councilmember Buxton. I think you've asked excellent questions, but it's a little hard to provide direction at this point because there's a number of unknowns, and I realize we have a timeline. And if we have to have extra econ meetings while we vet this out, that's fine. But this is potentially of a substantial impact to the city of Des Moines. And I'd like to know. I mean, the other thing is that it's included, hotels are allowed in institutional zones. Well, we have significant pieces of property zoned institutional. These could be massive. One such property is 29 acres. So yeah, we get to talk about density and we get to talk about things like that, but I don't know how we get to talk about it. There's no percentages, there's no example. And so when somebody comes down and they force something like this down on us, and then they say, oh, and you got to do it in 10 weeks or whatever. I don't know what the timeline is exactly, but I'm just saying, I think we need time and the staff needs time to get us the information around, are there proximity restrictions? Do we have the ability to change some of our zoning? Should we need it? Zoning changes don't happen overnight. We all know that. So that's going to take some work. I'd also like to understand more about the term independent living, because if you're in one of those little houses like I'm seeing in the middle of the screen, I guess I'd call that independent living. Or is the definition such that they have to be able to earn income and pay rent and so forth, and that we are migrating people from the great need to being enough of a productive member of society that they can generate some income, and this is some lower cost opportunity for them. As you can see, I'm frustrated because I don't have real answers. This is what this thing kind of says. And I'm not upset with staff. I'm a little upset that this thing flew through Olympia, and now we're sitting here trying to figure it out. So I think, to be really clear, you've heard some of the things I've asked, and I'd really like to know what those things are and what they mean before I get behind anything. And the other thing is, what if we're late? There is a compliance piece, but what does that mean? So we don't know if our dollars being allocated elsewhere are going to count. We don't know what the compliance piece means. We don't know if we can change zoning to make it more appropriately fit the layout of the city. We don't know if there's proximity considerations to churches and schools and things like that. There's so much that's vague here. It's very difficult for me to say I can get behind anything just right now. And I would, even at the dais, this would be very difficult to even consider a vote.
Mr. Chair.
Yeah, please, Michael.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. As always, very eloquent. So I guess that, this is difficult. And I guess there are two parts in how we look at it. So one part is what we don't know. And I think that Councilmember Buxton and the mayor have very well stated a lot of pieces we don't know or understand yet, or what requirements will relate. A few of the things we do know are that, so essentially, I would characterize this as we're now responsible to set the table for the opportunity to address issues related to homelessness, transitional housing, all the things in this bill. And so with that comes some considerations I just want to mention. We need to both look at what type of provision of services would need to be a part of this. And what I've always argued, and when Skip started, what I was arguing there was that the solution to homelessness is a comprehensive solution.
Yes.
Involves, and it may be that there are ways we can kind of piggyback off potentially some other programs, but it requires access to healthcare and mental health and drug addiction, employment services, just a lot of pieces. In fact, even today I had a discussion with Nicole about if we had a facility like this, or facilities plural, in the city, is there any way to incorporate the residents into any type of park activities or competition or ways to get healthy, in terms of exercise or opportunities for that. But on the flip side of that is another consideration, which is what will this mean for the allocation of our law enforcement resources? And we'd have to look at that very carefully. And so it seems like the role here is probably going to be that we have to establish the zoning with the appropriate support services to the degree we need to. Look at what the private sector is going to be doing, both nonprofits, grants, and other things that Eric knows quite a bit about. And then what role does the city need to play in regard to all of that? And then at the same time, we need to answer those questions in the context of the issues that the mayor and Councilmember Buxton have raised. And I know Chair Nutting has raised at other times with concerns about how all this works. So the thing is, we don't know the answers. We're being asked to provide our perspective before we know what the level of complexity is. I think that if we don't get credit for the SCIP money, then there's no question we should stop providing it and utilize it locally, if that's the case. But I'm sure other cities are in the same, have the same perspective we do. So maybe SCIP becomes a vehicle to help with all of this. But I think that our staff has done a good job of trying to sort this out. This was fought at Olympia, but not effectively. And I know Anthony was part of that effort, and I know AWC got involved to stop it or change it, and that didn't happen. And so there were some cities who were supportive of this and others that were not. And so that complexity allowed this to kind of go through. So once again, unfortunately, the legislature is forcing us to take actions with almost no time available to solve a problem that's not been able to be solved nationally, statewide, or regionally. And now it's being directed that local governments will solve this problem under these conditions. And we need to determine precisely what the conditions are. But I think that's where we are. And I think council is very appreciative of the complexity and the sensitivity of how we go about doing this. And I would just say, Mayor, I think that the property you refer to would not be available because of the cost. But I'm not saying, you can never say
one of many.
Yes, that's right. You're absolutely right. So I just want to point out some of the confusion. I think our staff, I appreciate Eric and Denise, Susan kind of trying to break this down into a manageable understanding.
Well,
But
if I
it is
could,
very complicated.
I'd like to add another consideration here. One of the things I find interesting about a piece of legislation like this is it doesn't take the everyday property owner into consideration, especially if there aren't any proximity parameters. And this is concerning to me because now all of a sudden, something that's being thrust upon the city has the potential to provide negative impact throughout this long and narrow community. And folks don't even know it's coming. And it will come like a freight train because they put time parameters on it. I feel that, first of all, we should express our disappointment to our legislators that the fact that we weren't even consulted on this. But I also, and I'm not talking about going to war, so please don't read into what I'm saying, but I'm saying we should say that we have serious concerns about this as we know more about it and call them out specifically. We should also share that, whether it be shared in the next version of the city currents or whatever, but people should know that this is going on in their community. And I know it's going to make some people upset, but this piece of legislation I find really concerning because it's like, we've spent a lot of time trying not to be Seattle. And now Seattle's going to go down and use their influence and get, and kind of force something our way. We can do whatever we can to manage, mitigate, as you were talking about, Michael. The one thing that's killing me is all the pieces to homelessness that you called out, and this doesn't address but a fraction of them.
Yeah.
That's upsetting.
Mayor, if I can make one comment relative to that. Another option, which I mentioned to Denise, and I don't know what the regional dynamic of this will be, but this may be a time, given the presence of the light rail up on Pack Highway, to revisit Vision Midway with Kent, given the TOD aspect of the light rail, and see if there's a way that maybe there's a sort of multi-city solution to some of this. I don't know, but that's just something that comes to mind because
it's a reasonable thought.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. I think your concerns, no one's saying that, creating a healthy transitional dynamic for homeless people should present problems, except it does.
Correct.
And so your point, I think, is exceedingly valid. And yeah, I thought we should also, PSRC's put out these growth targets. Well, now this is going to play into that. But apparently in our comments previously, we've identified some of these issues with them. And I don't know what role PSRC played in the legislature, probably not too great. And I think Anthony, my sense, and correct me if I'm wrong, but this thing just went like wildfire through there.
Yes, and to address the mayor's point and your points, Michael, we were somewhat consulted on this in that cities were invited to have a place at the table. AWC weighed in, planners and community development weighed in, but it is very difficult when a lot of cities are on one side and many cities are on another side, and there wasn't a unified voice, and that makes it very difficult for legislators. And many incredibly controversial things passed this year, which have not been able to pass in previous years, and that may have been partly because of the remote nature of the legislative session. In that, yes, people were able to weigh in, but not nearly as effectively as you can when you can stop and actually talk to someone. When everything is by text, or you're trying to catch someone on Zoom for 5 minutes, and it's it's fundamentally different. But this, so yes, it looks several times that this bill was going to die, and it did just barely squeak out of the Senate, 25-24, and a couple times AWC had said pretty confidently it's not moving, it's over. But in the legislature, nothing's over till they adjourn, and this one did come back and pass, and it is causing all of us to scramble considerably right now.
Eric, you had something to add, and Tracy, then I'm going to talk about it. We have one more thing, King County countywide planning policies update, and about 14 minutes to take care of that. So we either continue down this road and punt the King County down the road, or let me make a couple comments that I think would help, and Eric make his comments, and we move on.
Okay. So the only two things I was just going to mention, first was that when it comes to housing, emergency housing, shelters and such, this could also include youth and youth shelters. Specifically in Tacoma, there's what's known as the Arlington Youth Campus. It's actually nationally recognized now and award-winning for multiple services offered, as well as shelter and warming centers for that vulnerable in-school populations that exist. And within the Salishan community, it's actually seen a reduction in crime in that community as well. So there are different models to consider. It's not always the housing first, regardless of your situation. There's other items, as in, those that are trying to further their educational degrees and such. So we can put other considerations like that as well.
Okay, and my only comments are I'm always geared towards the building code aspect of it, and what concerns me is the fact that we have a couple large churches with lots that, if they chose to allow these temporary facilities, they could build potentially these single dwelling units on their property. So not knowing what the code is and how we can control that with the code, I'd be mindful when you're going through this to take a look at that as well, because we're not just talking about apartment buildings. There's a possibility of single homes that are 8x8 or 8x10 or whatever going up, like that one picture in the middle of the screen showed. And the churches would be able to do it, even with what we did a couple years ago with their housing and sheltering. So we passed code on that too. So Councilmember Buxton, did you have just one last quick comment?
A quick question is, does a city have the prerogative of putting parameters around some of these, like wraparound services? Can a city require that wraparound services go with any facility that goes into one of these in a zone? And then I guess my next question is, are we going to, I am in favor of at least directing staff to put some draft work together on this, because there's such a short time for them. It doesn't mean that we're going to necessarily approve, but it gives them a head start to get going. At least I would be in favor of that. So.
Well, and I think when you talk about these wraparound services, I mean, can we say, if you're living in these facilities, there's no weapons, there's no, you can't be a sex offender, there's no drug use allowed? I mean, these are the types of things that it's not clear.
Yeah, Mayor, we can research some of that. I think that there is some ability to put parameters that relate to public health and safety. So that's kind of the litmus test, and we'll work with the city attorney's office on what we're able to do there.
All right, does staff have enough information from the committee to move forward?
I think so.
Yeah, I think we do. I think that what you're seeing you know, we're operating in the same dark that you are relative to this. Now we all know the same amount of information, and there's a lot of missing pieces, but we will do our best to try to assemble those into something rational. I know that Denise attends the planning directors meetings, and we could try to piggyback off what other people are doing or how they're looking at it, so we don't reinvent the wheel here. But I think the next, I'm sorry, I think the next step is on the, I believe we have a meeting scheduled on the 29th, if I'm not mistaken. And so we would want to bring back to you quite a bit of information at that meeting and just let you know where we are. And hopefully we're at a point where Councilmember Buxton, we can, you know, there's enough distinction, you guys could say, well, let's go in this direction. That would be our goal.
My calendar is showing, Michael, that at 4 p.m. on July 22nd, we have an environment and we have a transportation meeting, but we don't have an econ meeting on that day.
I think on the 29th.
On the 29th, I do show, you're right, he does, the calendar does show just those meetings on the 29th. I will not be at those. It doesn't look like, but
Okay, well, we'll work with what
you
we
need
can.
to move. You need to move forward.
Yeah. So if we confirm that Councilmember Buxton, Chair Nutting are available that day, we may be able to take some extra time if we need it and just kind of walk through the issues. I think, Mayor, we can represent your concerns pretty effectively.
I believe you can, and I believe my colleagues will update me, or the staff will.
Sure, absolutely.
Well, thank you very much. We've got only about 8 minutes for the next King County countywide planning policies update.
I will provide that update. Denise Lathrop, Planning and Development Services. This is pretty brief. We reviewed and provided comments on the draft countywide planning policies back earlier this spring. We had quite a few comments on the housing element, and a number of South King County cities provided a detailed comment letter to the Growth Management Planning Council. They considered the comment letter on their meeting on the 23rd of June and recommended approval of the countywide planning policies substantially in the form that they were provided to the GMPC. We did adopt several amendments to reasonable measures section that came from input from the South King County cities, and mostly clarified that reasonable measures shall be informed by local data and analysis. So I think our biggest concerns is the one-size-fits-all approach doesn't always work when you're evaluating housing demand and supply, and especially with regard to affordable housing. So the for those proposed or recommended amendments that weren't carried forward, they directed the Affordable Housing Committee to convene and take another look at the housing chapter to respond to the concerns from the South King County cities related to affordable housing distribution, targets, and accountability, and then come back with some recommended changes to the housing chapter by the end of next year, 2022. So we may be seeing some additional changes coming in the future. And right now, the county council is expected to take up the countywide planning policies over the next few months. And then if they make any substantive changes, then those would actually go back to the Growth Management Planning Council for consideration. Otherwise, they will move those forward for ratification by cities this fall. And we usually get a notification of the ratification when those pass. That is all I have.
questions, colleagues?
Just a comment of thanks for your work, Denise. Well done, and it's mentioned even outside of the city. You know, every time I bring this up in a regional situation, we're on it, you're on it. Thank you very much. I read the letter that you sent, great letter, appreciated it, was mentioned, Public Issues Committee, so great job, thank you.
All right, well, that looks like it brings us to the end of our meeting. Is there any other comments from anybody? Councilmember Buxton?
I'd like to make a request with the agreement of my colleagues, if you feel also, I was wondering if it might be possible at the next econ meeting to have an update on the progress of our work plan, just a brief overview of how we're doing on at least the tier 1 items. And it looks like we're going to be having another meeting this month. It may be taken up with the whole thing may be taken up with this discussion. So if that's the hot issue and we need the whole hour for that, this is more, if we have time and my interest.
Well, Mayor Pina?
That may be able to be provided in written form, just because the plan exists and I mean, I'm not sure what depth you're looking for, but they should be able to just say, you know, complete in work or whatever. Or are you looking for more detailed up?
No, that's about the detail, just, you know, the tier 1 bulleted items and maybe the hottest things on tier 2 or something, just a short, yes, we're working on that. That was put off for COVID. We're completed with that, just like you said.
So what I would recommend is that we include it with the next econ packet.
Yeah, I was just going to say that.
As a written correspondence, because I think there's going to be there's going to be a bit of discussion, learning. I mean, the staff's got a ton of work. If you ask me what we just covered, they've got a ton of work. And so let's let them get into that and, you know, enable you guys with the meaningful information. And then, yeah, I think the work plan, just understanding where our status is, that makes sense. And they can do that in a written form.
Okay, happy to provide that.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, if there's nothing else, motion to adjourn.
Moved.
Second.
All right, we're adjourned. Thank you very much, staff, for all the time and effort put in. Thanks.
Thank you.